For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Professional Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Welcome to today's Entrepreneur, presented by FL Fuller Landau. My name is Josh Miller, and tonight I am flying solo. Dan Delmar, who is normally co-hosting the show with me, is enjoying vacation. Every now and then, I guess you have to enjoy vacation. I know, and we'll speak with Helge Seetzen from TandemLaunch soon, and hear that he can't always take vacation, or at least not in his earlier life, but when he's reincarnated in TandemLaunch, hopefully a little bit more. And as we do at the beginning of every program, we are going to go through some of the business news of the week. It's been, as usual, there's always some stuff that hits the papers, and this is the time that we're going to share it with you. So we're going to get right into it before we get to Helge Seetzen of TandemLaunch, who's in studio now, and I'm sure he has a couple of comments on some of the stories that have hit the papers this week. But let's start with M&M Meat Shops. People know this name. It's been around 30 some odd years. There's locations in many municipalities and many neighborhoods. I don't know how many people use it these days as much, but people are certainly they want their prepared foods. People are on the go often. But there's an article that came out in the BNN and the Business News Network that they're looking, and as we've discussed on a number of programs over the last few weeks, it's the health conscious. It's really being in the forefront of why is the customer coming into the store. There's no question that it's going to be about health and changes and living a little bit longer, putting the right foods into their mouth, into their bodies. And M&M Meat Shops, who have been really working on these prepared foods, these frozen foods, the ready to eat, bring home and cook, they're no different. And they recognize that there has to be change. Certainly in the last year, they've introduced 100 new products ranging from frozen sushi to fish tacos, something they didn't always do, and not in the last 35 years in any event. So they're really trying to reach health-conscious consumers. And really what the article is saying is that M&M wants to leverage the sticker shock of consumers when they're being faced with shopping for fresh products. And if they can mass produce and buy and still create a good food product at the end of the day that people can walk in and purchase, well, then that's where they should be heading. So it's hopefully not too late a revival, not too late a reinvention. There's no doubt that there's an online aspect to it as well, as people can go online and order food and pick up as they go. I think it's something that they've had no choice but to reinvent. I've known a few M&M franchisees over the years, and it's been a struggle because it's been a constant product that hasn't really changed. So for them to reinvent themselves was an absolute must. I guess we're going to move on to tomorrow is the federal budget. And lots of people have been talking about the federal budget. Certainly CJD and Aaron Rand and all that have been talking about the federal budget and the rumors that are circulating out there about, what is going to happen, what may happen, what are the cuts that Trudeau and his team and Morneau were talking about. And I guess I'll mention three of them that people are most concerned about. One of them being the capital gains exemption, the capital gains inclusion rate, where right now you sell something, it's not your house, but you sell your business or what have you, and you only pay tax on 50% of it. Well, now that people are thinking maybe it's going to go to 66 2/3, maybe it's going to go to the old 75%. So that's really that's one concern. Another concern has been the access to the small business rate, where Quebec, as we know, in a previous budget, said, well, you only have access to small business rate if you have at least 3 full-time employees. Well, aren't small businesses also about businesses with less than 4 full-time employees? So there was worry that Canada would follow. And then another one, which kind of affects the startup community and the tech community, is the employee stock option plans that are sometimes very attractive certainly as a startup, as to attract talent into your group. And they're talking about maybe reducing the benefits and the deductions on that. So that's something that, and I'm sure when we talk with Helge later, that's something that they definitely could hurt some of the tech businesses and tech startup. Now, the reality is everybody has these fears, everybody has these rumors, but I'm not so convinced anything is actually going to go through. If they actually listen to the advice of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance, chances are they'll probably leave a lot of this alone. But I guess we'll find out tomorrow. As we get into this, I think we, and Helge's been in the startup scene and an incubator for quite a number of years. There was an article in the Financial Post, the Salesforce Ventures boss had said Canada's startup scene is struggling to compete because of funding woes. And he goes on because he says that Canada is just a small market and the startup community just doesn't understand maybe how to pitch and maybe doesn't have the right access to funds. So everything becomes that much smaller and that much less attractive maybe to the big boys south of the border. I guess I'm going to turn to Helge and I'm going to ask him, what do you see? You've kind of been on both sides of the border. You see it, you travel often. Do you find this accurate that Canadian startups just don't necessarily have the right experience level and they maybe think too small?
Yeah, I definitely do. So I couldn't agree more with the gentleman from Salesforce. I've lived in the Silicon Valley. I've obviously lived in Canada and in multiple places. I've done business in Vancouver and Montreal at various time frames over the last 15, almost 20 years. And what you see is that really all the numbers just scale down. So whether it's the valuations or the capital commitments or the exit values, all that stuff is roughly 2, maybe 3x lower at the very least at the beginning. And then that has a multiplicative effect where if you're 2x lower in all the numbers at the seed stage, that means your potential to grow in the next stage gets lower. And so we really, a lot of good things have happened in Canada. There's been a lot of progress in the startup section, but we're still behind the US on a lot of these factors.
But hopefully improving as we get, certainly with the US versus Canadian dollar, there's certainly an attraction or a bargain that can be made or had from some of the money people, the venture capitalists down south, and maybe that will help gain knowledge from the Canadian startup side. There was another article in the Financial Post, and it was about the sharing economy. And there was a gentleman that from Rover Parking, Grant Bridgeton, and he was saying, launch first, ask questions later. Don't be so worried about all the regulation. Don't ignore them, of course, but don't be so worried about making it perfect and making sure that everything's getting hit before you start. Launch first, ask questions later. And leading an incubator, TandemLaunch, Helge, what would you say to that statement?
Approach it carefully. So that advice is very true, I find, for markets where the amount of engineering effort to build a first product is low, a website or something like that, so you don't have to make a big upfront investment, and the impact of failure is low, right? So if you're doing a sharing website for hotel rentals or for Airbnb-like stuff, by all means, go out, do it, because what's the worst thing that can go wrong? You spend $20,000 a bit of time, you did it, not a big deal. If you're doing something, let's say in the medical devices space, Theranos has tried to do this, and they got hammered, and now the FDA is suing them, and there's all sorts of bad things happening. So you want to be careful in judging what can go wrong, and don't follow the regulation for the stuff that can be bad.
There's no doubt that you want to get all your ducks in a row, but it doesn't necessarily have to be perfect. So it's definitely a launch first, ask questions later, but ask some questions first. That was Helge Seetzen that you were listening to of TandemLaunch. We're going to have his profile right after the break.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Professional Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Welcome back to Today's Entrepreneur, presented by FL Fuller Landau. This is FL's Josh Miller. The voice you're not hearing tonight is Dan Delmar. He is enjoying some vacation time, well-deserved, no doubt. And we are here spending time talking with TandemLaunch, the creator of TandemLaunch, Helge Seetzen. Welcome, Helge, to the program. Again, I know we heard some comments before in the business news of the week, but welcome to the program. And right after the 45 break, the discussion we're going to have with Micheline Maillet, who from FL Fleur Landau, is going to be on some human resource challenges for startups. So that should be interesting. Stay tuned for that. In the meantime, again, we welcome Helge Seetzen of TandemLaunch. And Helge, tell us exactly what TandemLaunch is.
Thanks, Josh. Pleasure being on the show. TandemLaunch is, at the heart, we're a venture capital fund. We invest $500,000 into early stage projects to scale them. But the unique element we have is that we build our own companies. Rather than investing in existing businesses, we build and then incubate businesses from scratch, based around technologies from universities all over the planet and leading entrepreneurs and technologies really from all over the world that we bring here to Montreal to build new companies.
We hear a lot about incubators. We hear a lot about venture capitalists. How do you select the groups and the companies that you work with? What makes it a little bit different than your neighbor at the other end of the block?
We select them very carefully, but the main distinguishing factor is that, as I mentioned, we really build companies from nothing. So to give you a practical example, we will find technologies at Caltech or Stanford or even exotic places like King Abdullah University of Science and Technology at Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. We find interesting tech. We then find entrepreneurs who have the skill set, both from a technical and business perspective, to maybe lead those companies, bring those things together. So really synthetically assemble companies. And that is something that's quite unique. I don't know of anybody else, certainly nobody in Quebec and possibly nobody in Canada that does the same thing.
So you're working really closely with the universities. So they've already started some of these projects. They've vetted some of these I guess, proprietary aspects?
Yes, so in general, they have done underlying research to validate the science and make sure that the stuff works, at least at the theoretical level, maybe build some prototypes. And we can then help them take it to the next level. We can take that sort of scientific paper or that first invention and turn it into a commercial product that gets distributed to hopefully millions of people.
How many universities do you work with?
We interact with well over 600 universities across the globe. We probably sign 50 to 60 transfer deals per year with universities, again, all over, that we then funnel into maybe a dozen companies or so.
When you first started TandemLaunch, how long ago did you start TandemLaunch?
6 years ago.
When you first started 6 years ago, did you already have some universities on board? Was this part of your original plan?
Yes. So while TandemLaunch is in quotation mark only 6 years old, making us actually one of the oldest accelerators or incubators in Canada in many ways, I had done this for the last almost 20 years. I've built technology companies out of university intellectual property since 1999, so I'd done deals with more than a dozen universities before that. And that obviously was sort of the seed package for TandemLaunch. The first guys I would call up would be the guys I've done business with beforehand.
And I know you're dealing with universities, but there's another aspect because the products has to be supported by manufacturers and sometimes the OEM. So when we come back from the break, we'll hear about how you kind of blend the OEM and the university to create this product that incubates within TandemLaunch. You're listening to Today's Entrepreneur on CJAD 800.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Professional Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Welcome back to Today's Entrepreneur. We are here sitting with Helge Seetzen of TandemLaunch. And before we left, we were talking that TandemLaunch, a company, its incubator, it really gets new companies off the ground, certainly provides a lot of resources, and works with a lot of universities and the products and prototypes that they're developing. But naturally, I know there's another side to it. I know there's an OEM, an original equipment manufacturer, that also helps kind of reduce your risk. Maybe you can explain to us how that works.
That's absolutely correct. So the good news is universities have a lot of cool technology. They do wonderful things. But to give you a sense of scale, so last year we got 5,800 technologies submitted to us from universities, of which we can fund maybe a handful, maybe two handfuls. So clearly we need to have a mechanism to evaluate what's good or not necessarily what's good, but what's appropriate for us from an investment perspective. And we do some of this in-house, but a lot of it we do in partnership with large consumer electronics companies. So these are the companies that you would find in your average Best Buy, Samsung, Apple, Toshiba, Panasonic, those kind of companies. And we work with a lot of them to narrow down what they see as the next major trends, and then how those technologies could flow into those opportunities, how we could matchmake a great market opportunity with a multi-billion-dollar impact with a great technology or set of technologies that might actually solve a real-world problem.
How often do you meet with them? Like, how often do you bring them in? Do you bring them early stage? Like when you're vetting the university and the product, do you automatically have an OEM in mind and put them together real quick?
Yes. So it's a bit of a continuous process because we incubate companies continuously. So at any given point in time, if you walk into our facility, you will see some really early stage concepts that are just in its infancy. You will see some established kind of early businesses with maybe 10, 15 people that are building their first product. And then, you will see some of our older companies that are 50 to 100 people, building, making millions of dollars of revenue and so forth. And the OEMs, our partners, come usually. Everyone comes once per quarter, and so they always see some of the young ones to validate. They see some of the mid-stage ones to encourage them and work them on design, and they obviously do business with the old ones.
Now, you have to get to these companies. You have to, these companies, the Samsungs, the Panasonics of the world, have to look at you and say, okay, TandemLaunch, you're in Montreal. You got to be worth looking at. What's your background? How are you able to get to these big rollers?
I've basically spent my whole life in this field. So I started my first tech company. I founded it out of in my undergrad at UBC in Vancouver. I built an electronic paper display company that worked with a number of these large OEMs. I then started another company doing what ultimately became my PhD. That licensed and worked with another dozen or so large OEMs. I then sold that company to Dolby Laboratories, which in turn licenses to hundreds of major OEMs and consumer electronics companies. So I've spent pretty much my whole adult life doing business with these companies, and that obviously helps. The other thing that helps is basically that we have built a great portfolio of 14 awesome companies that actually do business with these players. And so they look forward to seeing the next young ones because they like the old ones.
And I guess, we always talk on the show about relationships with your suppliers, relationships with your partners. How important is that to you? And what do you do to maintain those relationships? Is it just finding the right match with the right product? Do you spend more time? Is there anything that you can maybe share with us?
First of all, you're absolutely right. It's critically important that you have those relationships. They provide so much leverage. And the way to maintain them ultimately, you do a bit of whining and dining and those kind of things, but ultimately it's about delivering value that makes other people successful, right? I give you an explicit example. So the project manager that was the Samsung sort of project manager on a joint development I did in my second company with Samsung, is now the president of Samsung Electronics. And he built his career in part on that joint project. That joint project was to develop what is now called LED TV, which Samsung is the largest display maker on the planet. They are the introducer of LED TV. That's our technology. That was that startup's technology. And that forms long-term bonds.
And there's no doubt there's a lot of intellectual property, and that plays a big part of it. So when we come back after the news break, we'll chat more. We're talking with Helge Seetzen of TandemLaunch, and more with that story coming up soon.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Professional Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Welcome back to Today's Entrepreneur, a program about the entrepreneurial spirit that drives Quebec business. My name is Josh Miller from FL Montreal. Dan Delmar on vacation tonight, so we're wishing him well. Later on in the program, we're going to have Micheline Mayette from FL talking about human resource challenges in startup companies. And right now, we're talking with Helge Seetzen of TandemLaunch. Helge, you've been around. TandemLaunch itself has been around 5-6 years. You're dealing with some fantastic technology that's coming from universities and working with the OEMs. Can you give us an example of maybe one of the cool products that's sitting under your roof right now?
Certainly. I love all my companies equally, but here's some cool ones that maybe the listeners will appreciate.
It's funny, my mother says I love my children equally, but yet somehow, the one's the favorite.
Yeah. So, to give you an example, so we do deep technology companies. One example would be a venture called Sensing Dynamics. The technology comes out of NASA, the Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech, and it's a very simple chemical sensor that could be as simple as a sheet of paper that just has some material smeared onto it, that combined with some very sophisticated machine learning algorithms can act as a universal sensor like an electronic nose. So it can smell, it can sense really anything from not just when you breathe on it, if you drink alcohol or not, but if you drank scotch versus vodka. It can tell if there's pollen in the air. It can tell if what your blood glucose level is by just breathing on it. It can tell if this food is fresh versus this food isn't, and so forth. So, and all of the exact same disposable simple sensors. So it paves the way for a generalized smell or sensing solution for all applications of a single sensor and just a lot of software in the cloud.
Super cool stuff. Now, that naturally leads to the question of intellectual property and, protecting the IP, protecting the knowledge and the patents. What do you do for that? How do you ensure that happens?
Obviously, intellectual property is key to what we do. In this particular example, the originator, the Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech and NASA, they've spent about 15 years in research on this technology. It's actually used in the International Space Station. It's up there in orbit right now. They have a broad portfolio of technology that we inherit, that our startup inherits when we do this partnership deal with NASA. In addition, we've filed usually a broad range of patents more around the engineering development. And that's what we do in-house to protect sort of the product implementations, the ideas around the system-level design, which is not necessarily something that the researchers will have worried about, but is quite critical for commercialization.
Now, you have these various companies in the TandemLaunch family that's sitting under your roof, that they're not independent companies yet. They're really part of TandemLaunch. What is the relationship of the inventor with TandemLaunch, the investor? How does that work in your company?
So ultimately, our job is to bring great people and great technologies together. So our job definitely is not to run these companies we don't have any aspiration to do so. Our job is to build great teams that do that. Now, early on, those teams don't exist yet. So our job very much is to find the technology, to find the market, to find the first entrepreneurs, bring them together and start that initiation. And of course, organically, sometimes it's the entrepreneur that has the spark of wisdom that creates the business plan, and sometimes it's us and so forth. But early on, our job is this formation of the idea. And then we gradually become more and more hands-off. So after that, we will still provide a lot of close advice. They will still be in our building, and we help them find their footing. We invest that $500,000 to get them running. And then once they raise a few more millions of follow-on financing, they will find their own offices in Montreal, and we become more and more advisors to them.
We're talking with Helge Seetzen of TandemLaunch. Helge, inventors aren't always entrepreneurs. They aren't always business people. Is that what you find? Is there a gap that you kind of have to, or you feel you have to bridge?
Very much, and this is in part why we exist, because we can disintermediate the two pieces. So normally when you're an inventor at a university and you want to build a startup around your technology, it has to be pretty much you that go and raises money from venture capitalists. And often those inventors don't want to do that, or they're professors that don't have any interest in it, or they're not skilled at it, or they don't have the sales skills. So what our model allows us to do is, for example, the inventor of this chemical sensor, Margie at NASA, Margie Homer, she really is not involved in the commercialization. She invented it. She came up with this, and we built a new team of entrepreneurial technologists and business leaders who are actually carrying this forward. They work very closely with her and the whole team at NASA, but it's really them that tackle the business challenges, and NASA tackles the scientific challenges.
Do you ever find yourself in conflict sometimes with the inventor and the resources and like how do you work out those conflicts?
Of course, there's always going to be some issues. We're all human beings. We work with dozens of people, hundreds of people really. Ultimately, you just try to make sure that structurally the interests are aligned. We're a VC fund without a management fee, which means we don't make money off our investors or of our entrepreneurs. We make money only when there's return on our investment. So ultimately, while people may agree with what I say or what I believe or my theories, they at some level all understand that we all win together and lose together. So that's the base condition. And then you just try to reason with people. Right? And generally, we've been very fortunate that we've been able to select entrepreneurs and leaders who are smart but also very strong, rational people, and usually things sort of sort themselves out.
at the beginning of the program, we were talking about how Canada is maybe a little bit behind the times, and certainly the investors and the knowledge and all that. How do you find the investors' knowledge? Is it easy for you to find investors to bring into your VC program? VC being venture capitalists.
Yeah. Yes and no. So we've been very fortunate that we've been able to assemble and build a very supportive network of investors, some very strong people from Canada, but also internationally. We have a very international outlook into what we do. The main challenge, though, for Canada is that startups is generational. So what we're starting to have is the first wave of entrepreneurs that have really built decent, good, strong tech companies that are starting to do this. But there aren't a lot of investors yet that have that experience. I this morning actually I was talking to somebody who is a seasoned entrepreneur in the game space from Finland, and she moved to Montreal. And she said, oh, gaming is a really strong sector in Montreal. This is great. And then after digging a bit, she was telling me what she realized is that while we have a lot of game studios, we really don't have a lot of people who have actually built those gaming companies. Mm-hmm. Ubisoft is a branch office of the headquartered in France. Most of our companies, that are here, somebody else created them somewhere else. So there aren't a lot of people that actually are the entrepreneurs having built those studios.
Is that why you have very much an international focus of your business between the universities and the OEMs and the investors? Was that when you first started, was it on an international base to begin with?
Absolutely. We've always been highly international in all aspects, where the people come from, the technologists come from, the markets come from. You said it at the very beginning, Canada is too small a market to spend much energy here. Now, of course, the companies are here and the jobs are created here and all the wonderful things happen here. What you want is you leverage the global economy for the local benefit, not the other way around. You don't try to build local businesses if you're in the startup world. It's too competitive for that.
And the team that surrounds you is absolutely important. Just before we have to break for traffic, just quickly, your thoughts on talent in Montreal and finding the right people.
There are great people in Montreal. Montreal has great engineering schools. There's great technical talent. Entrepreneurial leaders are a bit harder to find just because we haven't had that many successes. Right? We haven't had that many billion-dollar startups that have spawned off great executives. And obviously you can find them. We found many of our great CEOs and our great executives are from here. But I would say about half, if not more, are from abroad, that we bring in from abroad.
Excellent. Thank you. We're talking with Helge Seetzen of TandemLaunch. And coming up after the break, we're going to bring in Micheline Mayette into the conversation. She is a HR director at FL Fuller Landau. Our Helge's one piece of advice for today's entrepreneur coming up later in the program.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, chartered professional accountants and business advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Welcome back to today's entrepreneur. Inspiring stories from outstanding business people. Josh Miller from FL here with Helge Seetzen of TandemLaunch. And we're bringing into the conversation Micheline Mayette, our human resource director. And since the topic has been incubator company and startups, we figure, what better topic to start with dealing with some human resource challenges when it comes when you're starting a company.
Yeah.
So Micheline, and I know that every company has its challenges, and certainly starting, it's one thing when you're existing for 20, 30 years, trying to maintain a culture. At the very beginning, when you're first hiring your people, there's also got to be some challenges that entrepreneurs have to keep in mind. What would you say are maybe some of the first few things?
Well, like we were saying a little bit earlier, you end up with HR issues kind of once you hire your first employee, then you have a human resource, I guess, that you have on board. But obviously, the bigger the company gets, the more that they have to spend more time looking at their HR. So I would say, at the very beginning, obviously, it's hiring, these employees and getting them on board. So depending, there can be attraction issues, retention issues. Obviously, there's pluses and minuses to joining a startup. You have to find the right fit, really. You want somebody who is going to thrive in that more entrepreneurial environment.
Do you find that when you're first starting a company, people tend, or I guess the entrepreneur needs to hire for skills because they need to get stuff done, and maybe a little bit less on character and attitude at the very outset anyways?
Possibly, but I would say the fit is very, very important. I mean, you don't have 100 employees to rely on. You have a few. So, you want to make sure that they're there to back you up. They see your vision. They're on board with you. I'd say it's even more important. Every person is extremely valuable at that stage.
And I'll turn to Helge, and you have the TandemLaunch team under you, but then you have all these little mini teams that are all around. How do you manage, like when you first are putting people together, because that's what you do with the inventor and the entrepreneur and the president? What's your criteria? How you put together for fit, for skill? How do you work it?
This is definitely the toughest part of our whole business model, is getting these teams to form. Some of it happens organically, people just like each other. But mostly we try to assemble people with unique skill sets that we need for the business, bring them together, encourage them to form teams, encourage them to gel. Sometimes that goes really well. Sometimes it needs a bit more assistance. What we found is, over the years, we found that the more direct you are, pointing out all the issues, the better. Like early on, when we were building our company, we were ourselves a little bit insecure whether, we should tell about all the hard work that's ahead, or all the tough things, or all the ways things could go wrong. And more, every time we've decided, we're going to be a bit more blunt or deliberate about it, it has turned out to be a positive thing. Like we just, tell people what's happening. When people make the trade-off, whether they want to go in a startup or into a big company, just tell them the good and the bad, just straight up front, and then make sure that's true.
Take the guesswork totally out of it. This way you don't have to worry about interpretation later on. Thank you. We're talking with Micheline Mayette, of HR, Human Resource Director at FL Fuller Landau. And coming up after the break, we'll chat a little bit more about some human resource issues for startups, and of course, Helge Seetzen's one piece of advice for today's entrepreneur.
For professional advice with a personal touch, consult Fuller Landau, Chartered Professional Accountants and Business Advisors. Click on flmontreal.com.
Welcome back to today's Entrepreneur, program about the entrepreneurial spirit that drives Quebec business. We're here in studio with Helge Seetzen of TandemLaunch and Micheline Mayette, a Human Resource Director at FL Fuller Landau. And we're talking about startup companies and the challenges of, hiring and the culture. But startups ultimately, go beyond startup, and then you kind of grow up and you hit puberty, and so as you're thinking about after, beyond the first 2, 3, 4, 5 employees, maybe what are some of the things, Micheline, or maybe the top thing that comes into your mind about what the entrepreneur has to worry about?
I'd say it's finding the balance between, what do you want to keep informal versus what do you need to start formalizing to make sure that you're, compliant with laws, that you're still protected to a certain extent, and really finding the balance between the two. Like, for example, I think employment contracts, even in a very early stage, are good just to kind of set the expectations, make sure there's an agreement that both parties agree to and everything. So I'd say that's one thing.
There's a lot of companies that don't have a policy manual, and a lot of companies that do, and there's that fine line of when you should implement it. And I know there's no magic number, but when you're looking at some of the clients that you've dealt with, do you find that there's kind of a medium point, or kind of where the leader has to say, you know what, there's too many what ifs. We maybe got to put something down in black and white?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, once you hear grumblings, once, the managers start feeling they're not sure how to answer certain questions, or they feel they're not answering it the same way each time. For me, policies, it's really, it sounds very formal, it sounds very corporate, but it doesn't have to be so corporate and so detailed. It could just be general guidelines to follow, just to give, a baseline that people kind of know where they stand and know how to respond in different situations. Do
you find, and I don't know if I don't want to go down this path to have this whole discussion, but do you find different generations respond to different tactics? Helge earlier was saying we're very direct. Do you find that applies more to a different generation versus another one that can deal with a little bit of the ambiguity, a little bit of the give and take?
I find in general directness works. I mean, as long as it's done in a respectful way, obviously. But I find telling people where they stand and what to expect, I find it's the best approach in any case. And
no doubt, listen, every company is different, and every leader is different. So everybody will have to take their own path. Thank you very much, Micheline. I know there's always lots on the human resource front. As we said, at the moment you have one team member, one employee, you have a human resource issue. So now, as we do every week, we come to the last moment of the program. We'll turn to Helge Seetzen of TandemLaunch and ask you, Helge, what would be your one piece of advice for today's entrepreneur?
Create events. Good entrepreneurs figure out every day, every week, every month, how they can create an event, make something happen for the company. Don't let the world dictate your agenda. Figure out how to create actions that have impact.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that entrepreneurs don't always think about that event and that today. They focus so much on their business and their product and their service that they sometimes forget the environment around them. So absolutely great advice. My one little takeaway is that, and I know we talk about this often, is I know companies are in Montreal, but you got to think international. You always think way beyond your borders. That's really where success will come about. Thank you very much, Helge, for joining us. Micheline Mayette, thank you for being in studio as well. You've been listening to Today's Entrepreneur, presented by FL Fuller Landau. We are not here next week. We are back in 2 weeks on April 4th, so please stay tuned then. Thank you very much.